listening to some of the conversations of how maybe AI compute loads or clusters start to be designed to be more flexible loads on the grid, right? So that just the nature of how designs to meet the need of AI compute, we're in the infancy of that, right?
But yeah, I mean, there's some kind of core forces that I think seem to be as dependable as anything else I see when I try to crystal ball it. And I think the convergence of energy and power on one side and compute on the other seems to be a pretty durable one. Hi, I'm Christian Bonilla.
And I'm Sean McKay.
We're the co-CEOs of DMARK Energy Solutions, and you're watching the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast.
Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast, and I'm thrilled to be welcoming two very special guests today that are doing something very pioneering in the energy space. I'm welcoming Christian Bonilla and Sean McKay, that are co-CEOs of DMARK Energy, based in Colorado and Iowa. Christian and Sean, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Joshua.
Yeah, thank you.
It's my pleasure. So I'm super curious. This is a brand new concept. This is a brand new platform. How did you end up in the space with determining that the data center, critical facilities, digital infrastructure space had a need for and was ready for this kind of platform on energy?
Yeah, no, I'll share my thoughts on that first, and then let Sean go. So, I think really the kind of, there's a series of sparks, but the big one for me came when so I've been in B2B software on the product and founder CEO side for the last 20-ish years. It was actually my lead investor for my previous company that I founded reached out to me in kind of very end of 2023 or so. And he had been working with some of his other business partners, looking at this then still kind of newish phenomenon of Bitcoin miners going off grid in search of natural gas and going really upstream in search of energy resources to get the lowest cost energy for their compute needs. And I thought that was fascinating in and of itself. Just the idea of going, kind of right to the tap for natural gas and bypassing the grid and hooking it into gensets and ultimately server containers. And his view on it was that there's a market inefficiency here. We see people going to conferences trying to find natural gas that was either stranded or economically distressed or just excess supply, at reasonable prices. And the way he put it to me was there's a business opportunity on the inefficiency in all of this, bringing these parties together and doing this sort of this hand-to-hand connection and deal facilitation. But I think there's more opportunity in the long run by making this market more efficient. And that really spoke to my background. I started a marketplace company. I ran a rather large marketplace as part of the product at the company that actually acquired that business that I started. And I studied economics in college. My father and grandfather were economists, and something about that challenge just really appealed to me. And so that was probably the big sort of Damascus moment for me, I guess, in really paying closer attention to the dynamics of energy production, power generation, and how it all translates into compute. And the markets continued to kind of catch fire from there, I think, as we all know. So that was probably the big kind of tipping point, I guess, of inspiration for me. Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, I think, looking at the series, definitely it's Christian brought me in really to understand the whole ecosystem. So coming from a background of design and UX and product. And the first thing is always discovery and research and understanding. And so we're really doing that in that, again, almost outside of the AI and data center space, but around power and energy, and then high compute. And then it became apparent that we need to expand across and really understand the data center development cycle. How does that work? Where does power play into that? Because power is at the core, right, of all of it needs that. And we also have an infrastructure problem going on in the country. And how does the grid grow at a pace that can be sustainable, yet we need such demand right now? So to me, it's a very complex problem that was very attractive when I came into it. I spent a number of years studying and working and designing within agriculture in a very similar complex ecosystem. And so now we're trying to say it's very complex. It's a challenge for really the whole industry, the country. So how do we simplify that? And how do we kind of bring people together who don't normally do business and start to make that happen? So that's where the marketplace is born of how do we do that well with a product.
What's super interesting that you mentioned, Christian, was the colleague of yours that reached out that had heard that Bitcoin miners were looking to move into that space, because what I've seen over the last 6 to 12 months is a lot of Bitcoin entrepreneurs are trying to pivot their facilities into being AI data centers. So they went from like avoiding one set of community pitchforks to really diving into the deep end of if you thought a Bitcoin-based data center uses a lot of energy, where do you get a hold of one that's got thousands of GPUs?
No, absolutely. I mean, the power density of compute on the AI side was, not always as didn't have the same profile as the Bitcoin, mining needs, and what a difference a couple of years makes in that regard. I think there's something so like fascinating and kind of energizing, if you'll forgive the pun, about just the way I think the Bitcoin mining world just attacks engineering problems. And there's such an innovative, just sort of momentum and energy to, what's ultimately a return on capital business, right? And so I think that pivot that we see, or the maybe diversification is probably a more globally accurate term for it, that we see on the Bitcoin mining side. I think it just reflects the energy and electricity going to its highest economic use, right? It's bringing energy and compute together. It's a story of kind of the fight against entropy, and the most effective solution at the best unit economics wins in the long run, regardless of what those electrons are ultimately being used for, whether they're going into ASICs or into H100s, right?
What's fascinating too is this concept of marketplaces, because the reality is in the data center ecosystem, they're hanging around with technologists all the time. And IT has been really early adopters of SaaS marketplaces. Like all the big public cloud companies have had them for a long time. All the big SaaS companies have had them for a long time. But there's definitely pockets of the data center ecosystem, especially on the construction and real estate side, that have really lagged in many of these places. Energy may be another one of these pockets as well. So I'm super curious, like with what you've found so far, where are you finding is kind of the root cause of all of this resistance to date? Is it generational? Is it people just trying to protect their turf, being resistant to change? A lot of the operators sometimes blame technology adoption on covenants that they have with their huge companies as an excuse to, like, okay, we signed an NDA with some big enterprise companies, and because of that, like everything is one big secret and we can't have anything be transparent. Like, what have you found so far in your quest to figure out who the ideal clients are, the users, the segmentation?
Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, I think the challenge there, like you said, is you have business models that have been going on between parties that now are kind of being stressed or even broken, and people are trying to figure out, okay, now I need to do business with someone new. I might not have been in power directly, and we have such a demand. I'm being asked to now strategically look at power and how do we source it? Where does that go? And when that's happening, there is a lot of strategic aspects when it's just kind of race mentality that's going out there. And so we're looking at how do we create a marketplace that can respect that and solve with it so that they can be trusted. So we have how do you stay anonymous on both sides, find parties that have like needs and wants, and so that then you can start to unveil, here's the first level of confidential information, or here's the second level. But you have to have that first level that allows you to see, yep, I'm interested in that. It's valid. That's one thing we're hearing on the early inventory that we have in the platform now, is that it's really good stuff, in the sense that there's a lot of noise out in the industry right now of people claiming to have powered land when really it's a piece of land that has like transmission lines over it. They don't understand what it really means to have powered land and have a resource that's useful in the broader business sense. And so we're really attacking that so we can respect some of those business needs, also simplify it so that transacting is easy. So we always talk about find, trust, and transact. So how can we help people find? How can we help trust the information and the other counterparties? And then how do we make that transacting really fluid and simple? And so that means like we have in-platform messaging system. We have documents that can be signed. So we're really kind of pulling that together, because I think there's the other angle of this is, you know, you have everything from small, medium, large, extra large, up to hyperscale. And, you know, other than some of the large enterprise, they don't have the tool sets that allow the enterprise, you know, to get these deals done. So to have, kind of think of it as procurement, right? Simplifying that, purpose built, so you can find parties, interact with them, and really be focused with your use of time. I think that's really the key that we're trying to. And again, while respecting confidentiality and what you're letting and who's approved and who's under NDA, that's what we're helping manage, because it is such a dance that's going on right now.
Have you found that some of the players in the space have built internal systems that do pieces of this, and part of this is making it much more widely available to situations where it wouldn't be cost effective for a huge enterprise to serve small properties, small deals? Or is this such a new category that there's no like predominant industry group that has the nomenclature, the certifications, the credentialing, or anything like this to categorize this, and part of the system needs to build that?
I think we're still working through, well, how would I say this? There's so many different types of energy resources themselves, and different, let's just take on natural gas. How is that measured? How is it talked about, the nomenclature and everything there? You go up into power and understanding power and what's a powered site, what's a development. And we're really breaking that down to understand what's a good way of, I guess, normalizing that, so you can compare sites and understand what you're looking at. Because although there's industry terms, if you will, there's a couple different ways, or a couple different industry terms for everything, it seems. And so as it's kind of emerging, we're trying to help, figure out how can we create a structure to the listings that help communicate to a broader set of stakeholders who, again, may have different varying levels of understanding of energy and compute, because there's a lot of people getting put into new roles and asked to do things to keep up for their business.
I see some players sometimes that are so hungry for new roles. I get calls from time to time, not so much in your category. They're constantly looking for basically what could best be described as a channel partner, but they're so early on in the process, that one. And I ask them, like, who else is doing this? What's the track record? Do you actually have a defined program for onboarding, training, sharing best practices? And it's like a deer in headlights there most of the time, if they're calling me for something related to energy or real estate.
Right.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think there's just so much newness in this space, and I think that's emblematic of sort of a gold rush phenomenon in some ways, right? And I don't mean that derisively, but there's you've got a lot of different folks coming into the industry, or this confluence of industries, right? Kind of pulled together by what we see as, kind of one of the central trends or forces that kind of created this need is the on-site generation and consumption of power for these increasingly large load centers. You've people coming in from, turbine engineering backgrounds, from data center construction, from really more AI or information science backgrounds, and working across each of those and crafting a strategy for how those things come together is just not that common of a skill set. I mean, it's really several pretty rich areas of expertise that need to come together. And so there's a certain scale beyond which, particularly on the tech side, where there's your scale supports having maybe not all, but a good chunk of that expertise in-house, and those kind of cross-industry relationships are a little bit more established or kind of easy to activate. And in other cases, they're just not. And so solving problems of scarcity related to electricity or co-location space or whatever it might be is not where they began their careers, right? That requires working with folks with very different expertise that speak quite different languages, and are also themselves in some cases used to selling to counterparties that look very different. For a natural gas, just to go back to that example, for a well operator or a gathering system operator, an offtake agreement with a pipeline, there's an enormous amount of history and a body of knowledge around how those deals work. There's a lot of standardization for those kinds of things. For a data center, much less a Bitcoin, mining outfit, who is looking at very different time horizons than their energy resource or provider might be used to. It's just there's a lot of translation that needs to happen, and I think Sean alluded to just sort of the sort of race, speed to market, and just sort of the rush dynamic. There's quite a bit of folks just not knowing what they don't know, or not being as ready as they think they are, in terms of whether it's project readiness or financing or whatever it might be, that just kind of creates this need, not only for a marketplace that kind of brings them together, but that can sort of facilitate more of the kind of domain familiarity across them that's kind of lacking by nature of this all being a fairly new intersection of businesses.
So how does that lack of common language, lack of common understanding become an opportunity for your platform as opposed to a potential blocker from someone getting value? How do you look at that based on historically what you've done with different marketplace projects throughout your career?
Yeah, I think the key is how do we simplify it, right? And if we think about user experience and product and design, which has been my career, and I've been fortunate to work across many, many industries. And so part of the role of a designer is going in and understanding that problem space. And that means understanding terminology, mental models. How do people think about this? And when we look at this at that highest level, we not only are saying, okay, let's do our kind of research into it and some secondary research where we're kind of, what are some of the themes and trends going on? But then we started experiencing it ourselves. So we started we've been working off platform. We've been working with potential buyers and sellers with seller agreements and pulling that together to understand and really live those pain points. It's something very similar to when I was doing a lot of work in agricultural technologies, like help redesign an interface, touchscreen interface that's in for a manufacturer that's in tractors, sprayers, and everything worldwide. So we spent time with farmers out writing, watching, understanding, so we could simplify and make that common so people could work more efficiently. That's the mentality we're bringing here. It's a industry with many terms, lots of depth in every area. So we're living it and we're going deep in every area. So we can be a good, almost like translation layer, if you will, to bring that up and get a common way of talking about it. That's also, though, not oversimplifying, that has credibility. And so, because what we want to do is we want to be neutral, right? We're a neutral marketplace saying, here's a listing, here's the values and stats around that we find would be important for you and your first understanding of that listing. Then you got everything from that all the way through due diligence. And so how do you make that into kind of a conversation? So what do they need to know first? And there might be multiple stakeholders with questions. So understanding that and bringing that into a common workflow and common language is kind of the core of design. And so that's where we've been focused. And again, which has included like going to a number of conferences, but one of them going to NARUC, which is the National Association of Regulatory and Utility Commissioners. And so sitting through, these roundtable discussions of what's going on in the industry right now as far as the grid and why are there such challenges? Because you got everything from politics mixed into messaging that's coming from all different industries. And so we want to make sure we understand it so we can present it in a good, neutral, fair way. And we're focused on solving the business problems within that. And that's really where I really learned a lot on the state of our infrastructure and the challenges we have then now moving forward in as a society, as an infrastructure. We have generations now of the digital that's happened. Like I saw the internet, I was designing before the internet. Then the web came along, started designing on the web, and I saw that boom and I experienced it. Now we're seeing the AI boom in the same way. And so now it's about how do we think about, this isn't going to be the last one either. There's going to be multiple eras of digital innovation coming. And how do we as a country and as a society embrace that and be ready to have the power that's really needed to embrace that and do it in a business model in a way that we can start a new way of transacting.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. I think that was well said. The just to approach, the second part of your question, Joshua, around just kind of the differences and challenges in this kind of marketplace with these sorts of participants, as opposed to some of the things that I've worked on and that Sean and I've worked on together in the past. I founded a company called UserMuse about 10 years ago that at its core aim to connect professionals in industry using specific kinds of software or that working at organizations that did with product and design teams who were really trying to find enough people that they could get good market feedback or product usability testing with, and just kind of help them build their networks outside of their existing customers more easily. And so there's a specific set of challenges around that, but by and large, the person who is trying to find their target user or buyer or someone using their competitor's product, they have a pretty good idea of who they're looking for and what their ideal customer profile for that looks like, right? And so once they've connected and they've agreed and that facilitate or that connection has been facilitated, a lot of the work is really done at that point. Then they just go get to work for however long they want to, and there's not as much, I think, learning through the process. It's more from the buyer perspective. There's really more like sifting through inventory and picking exactly which ones you want. Whereas contrast that with the case of a of a data center developer that plays in this sort of, let's call it 10 to 100 megawatt, facility size range, which it's insane that that's probably mid-market now, but this is the world we live in. Everything has more zeros than it feels like is possible all of a sudden. But if we take that developer, they by all means they are knowledgeable about land and utilities and working with entitlements for projects, so that it's not that all of that is new, but there is a lot of new inventory and a lot of new players in the market, and a lot of new counterparties that they're working with. So they might be, and one of our sellers on the platform, we were talking with the other day, person I'm thinking of, I mean, they can talk at great length and in very learned detail about just about all of the any aspect you can think of related to large construction project organization and financing, but not really about AI companies and about what is going to drive which segments of that industry to advance from the public cloud to colo facilities to maybe a mix of their own and someone else's. And I think the default, there's a small handful of companies, hyperscale cloud service providers that everyone knows about, and then there's this great rest of the galaxy that is relatively unknown to them and is hard to sort of differentiate between. So I think that's kind of one big difference here, is the sort of, almost every participant in the market has at least some learning that they're doing in the process of, kind of organizing projects and then trying to get a deal together. And I think the other is obviously that once that connection is made, there's just so much more work that has to be done, both to facilitate a deal and due diligence, whether it's for an energy purchase agreement or for, a site deal or something like that. There's just the transaction and the process of them actually creating value together is just vastly more complicated.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
I think one comment that I'd want to make or build upon in that is, it's always gets tricky because we're talking about data centers. That's like a monolithic term when we say just, a data center and power. Those are two very monolithic terms, and especially because both are evolving right now. It's like new emerging industries happening. So both on power, suddenly the grid needs to grow at a certain rate to stay stable, and the investments, and how do you build out transmission lines in responsible ways, just all of that, right? And suddenly we need all this power. So now it's about, on-site power generation, and then how that might be for kind of bridge to grid. So when the grid gets there, how can that be now helping extend the grid, because it can be pushed back into the grid as part of the bigger system. Then on the other end, you have data centers that really it's about compute, and how are we going to have compute housed where? And that used to be, again, large monolithic buildings and brick and mortar, to now they're becoming modular. Now is it more about distribution? Do you get distributed modular going? I mean, everything from edge, obviously, to getting it closer to where the compute's needed. But now we're starting to look at how can compute, like whether that's a GPU cluster, and the technology around that, when a prompt is being sent in and needs to be responded to, right? That is happening, has different latency terms or needs than training a model. So those are two new things. And one of the conferences we're at, we're talking about how one of the people speaking was talking about how just the energy, the power profile of GPUs and how they ramp up and down is a completely new animal to even the grid and any kind of power. So now we're looking at, and that's not going to change either. That's going to, or it's going to change. It's not going to stay stable. Where it's going to evolve. And so there's just so much happening of evolution and innovation. It goes back to terms like, okay, what's modular? What's this? What's prefabricated? How do we express these things in a way that can have a common vocabulary, so people know what kind of project you're talking about? But we have our eye on where is this going as well, in the way these projects get implemented. So it's a fascinating challenge. I mean, from personally, I just get excited talking about it because it's a large scale problem that needs a lot of simplifying for us to do it well.
Yeah, you mentioned simplification, standardization, education, people speaking different languages. One of the areas that I'm super curious about as well to get your take on is when I think about go-to-market, I think about how I segment out the data center industry. There's 4 or 5 different kinds of data center operators. There's a couple dozen different kinds of data center technology companies. There's a dozen or so different kinds of facilities related companies, of which energy and power kind of live within. There's construction, real estate investors.
Mm-hmm.
The construction is for sure a first cousin of probably some of the users that you're thinking about. I put outsourced sales and marketing into another area. I know right now your website is organized into buying and selling, the demand and the supply. You've mentioned data center developers, you mentioned colocation, you've mentioned hyperscale, you mentioned on the supply side, natural gas, pipeline, transmission line. Like, what's kind of the 1.0 version of what you think about with segmentation, and what do you think is the biggest opportunity in those segments right now on both the buy side and on the sell side?
You want to take that one, Sean, or do you want me to go first?
Yeah, I'll maybe just zooming out a minute around. We've spent time, looking at what are the different. When I use the word ecosystem a lot, but it's, you look across all the different types of companies, types of roles, both traditionally and now what's new. And what we've started with is really we've kind of created this stack that is everything from that energy resource to power generation, delivery, land, a powered shell of some sort, up to compute assets and how does that workload. And every tier of that has lots of different kinds of companies, right? And so we're looking at like who's coming with what part of that stack. So is someone coming in who's doing like powered land development? Well, they're coming in, then they have an energy resource of some type, whether that's, natural gas, solar, hydro, whatever it is, and they have land for development and they're getting it ready for on-site. That is a profile around a power developer, land developer that is coming with part of that stack. And then we look for, then how do we meet someone who needs and has the rest of that stack, or is there a gap? So we've kind of looked at it in these verticals with different layers that are needed. And then it's about bringing those parties together, because we also have on the site, we have relationships with manufacturers as well. So whether that's natural gas generators or turbines for power generation, we have connected parties for that, and we'll be supporting them on the platform as well. So that's really all the components that are needed in these projects, because it becomes, how can we help fill that stack for everyone? Bring the parties together, and if there's missing pieces, bring them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's going back to your original question. It's around, you got everything from on-site power generation and parties that are working towards helping create that, whether that's at a product, or there's also some that's energy as a service for stopgap and coming in and helping bridge. And then you got more traditional, more on the data center side, and different ways those delivery models are forming.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of how we look at it broadly, I guess.
I think the one thing I would add to that, just around kind of what the 1.0 piece, and it's maybe interesting to just call attention to directly, because we always envisioned the verification and vetting that we would do, DMARK as part of the platform facilitation as a marketplace, is that, marketplaces at root, I believe, exist to do, if nothing else, two things, and it's reduce friction and facilitate trust between parties, right? And it just became clearer and clearer over the last probably half year or so, as we were kind of building. And for context, we really just kind of unveiled the platform and opened up really at the end of summer, so not quite 2 months ago. And we've been kind of working offline before then. But anyway, whether we're at conferences talking to people that are looking to find partners with certain land or energy assets, or you're talking to developers looking to sell, but whatever it is, the just screaming, flashing signal to us has been over and over again. People just lamenting how much crap there is in the market right now, and just how much of a pain it is for them to sift through the noise. And and we're not the first people to observe that, of course, but I think the volume just has been turned way up, compared to where we started on that. And so that verification piece, and that really just showed us how important it was for us to make sure that we didn't lose sight of verifying and vetting and emphasizing quality of listings and vetting of providers and buyers was going to be just right out of the gate. And what a huge value proposition that was. One of our team members who leads our sales and kind of biz dev, he an Oklahoma City guy, was a petroleum landman for a long time, has kind of lived and grown up in that world. And he just, not even in the course of his job, but just kind of just being around town and just going, talking to people in his network. I can't tell you how many times he just, shoots a note to us, say, talk to so-and-so, this producer or this operator in, the Wilson Basin or, in the Permian, who just says they're getting 10 calls a day and they just leave their phone on do not disturb because they're sick of getting inquiries from, people trying to sell him land or saying that they want to build a data center that just, he knows have no idea what they're doing, or maybe they do, and he just can't deal with the volume. And so that filter is even more, I think, crucial to the success of bringing parties together and making this an efficient, kind of useful and trustworthy marketplace than even we'd kind of imagined when we set out.
Almost sounds, based on what you're describing, that a lot of the resistance to digital marketing and digital sales practices that I've observed in this space over the last 10 years may be reasonably correlated to the lack of standardization and lack of transparency that you're seeing on this opportunity as well. And I look at like the 57 different business models we track in this ecosystem, the colo operators, most of the technology companies, some of the facilities manufacturers, like they've been doing a great job with blogs and podcasting and videos and webinars going back 10, 15 years. You wouldn't go to a company like that and find that, like, there wasn't a LinkedIn post in 6 months. But there's definitely pockets in the data center ecosystem, especially on the construction, especially on some of the real estate development side, where you'll hit their website and like the copyright date is from 3 years ago, like completely asleep at the wheel. And you wonder if that's where there's enormous opportunity in the space. But then again, the other part that's really super interesting with your challenge is we were having this conversation in the late 2010s, there'd be all these opportunities around the segmentation and the fragmentation around education, clearly, and like search optimizing and building topical authority and everything like that. We're in a world now where the Google search result is rapidly seeing dinosaur moments.
I mean, if you were dropped in from Mars and just told you have, a week to understand this industry and try to create your own sort of market map and neatly bucket companies, I mean, I think you'd have an extremely difficult time doing that, hell, with unlimited time. not least because of just these sort of interesting round tripping of deals between like chip makers and cloud providers and infrastructure and cross investment. So that even putting that aside, we have in our internal data stores, we have this like really extensive sort of classification of hundreds and hundreds of companies in this ecosystem. And just because we need some label, we have, each one has a primary industry label to it. And I don't find those terribly useful, because really what we have to do is kind of flatten the way we describe these companies out and do a bunch of binary flags, yes, no's. Do they develop sites? Do they buy sites? Do they sell them? Do they own them? Are they a potential gas buyer? Are they looking for this? Do they lease space from other data centers? Do they make them? And it's that sort of I was going to say dual nature, but only because I can't think of the word for multi-nature or, more than
dimensional.
Yeah, thank you. It really does make sort of the business models kind of complex to understand. And again, think of this from the perspective of somebody who's got, land with maybe a pipeline offtake point going through it, and is trying to understand like who is this a good fit for? I think I've got a valuable asset here. We've got clear title, we've got all this stuff, but kind of going back to Sean, what you said earlier, just like, okay, so what is a data center company exactly? Like that's, to your audience, I think, and most people listening to this, that's maybe not a complicated question, but you have to kind of be breathing and living this for a while before you get some intuition around who is interested in what and who's exposed to the costs of power directly and who's not, and all of that. So it again, sorry, I didn't mean to go off on that tangent, but it does kind of bring it back to how do we sort of help organize the world in a way that's simpler without oversimplifying, I guess, is kind of always the challenge.
Yeah, the cross relationships, because whether it's SIC codes or the North American version of that, the industry, I mean, LinkedIn's got a couple hundred different industry classifications. It's spread all over the place, and no one's consistent. If you go with how they classify their LinkedIn company page, you'll never get anywhere with having the structured data that you need to catalog all this. So yeah, part of it.
Even just within colocation, if you just stayed within there, wholesale, retail, was there a word for retail before there was wholesale? Do they manufacture containers and modular? Do they not? Do they build? Do they just lease and stuff? Like it's part of what makes this world so like rich and interesting for us, from a marketplace design perspective. But I mean, going back to kind of where we started the conversation, early on, it was there's no shortcuts to, I think, the learning curve of kind of understanding how all of the players in this industry interact with and transact with each other.
How do you think the industry is going to change in the next 2, 3, 4 years? If you had to look out into your crystal ball, it must be something that you're thinking about as you're building your roadmap, right?
Yep. So I think, I guess it's going to continue to emerge. New technology is emerging that, some of the conferences we were just attending and sponsoring and listening to some of the conversations of how maybe AI compute loads or clusters start to be designed to be more flexible loads on the grid, right? So that just the nature of how designs to meet the need of AI compute, we're in the infancy of that, right? So if you look at just how many times the chip manufacturers and the board manufacturers, and they're upping efficiency and bringing down, how the efficiency of compute, but also efficiency in power, so that you can get more for less power. But then the characteristics of that are going to change, like how loads can stop and be moved to another cluster somewhere else in the grid that has cheaper power. Those are things that are going to be coming, where loads are moving both to meet like critical times of day, whether it's on grid and you have certain time peak periods where you may get curtailed even, but if you're a peak time, can it move as a bigger system? Can it be set up so that compute can move around? So I think there's going to be a lot of just very new innovative thinking about how to solve the bigger problem, not just solve how to use the pieces that we're used to having on the chessboard. There's going to be new pieces coming out and new strategies to solve this. So that's the one thing that'll be true. It's going to continue to, I think it's going to more prefabrication, more experimenting with how to deploy in a diversified way. I think we're going to see a lot more of that and more part of our even environments where compute lives, not just big data centers you pass on a highway.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. I think, it just, so much of it comes back to the power question. I think I forget who it was who published, it might have been Wood Mackenzie or someone the other day, even 70% of data center development stakeholders or project stakeholders, I forget what term they used, but expect that their future projects will all assume on-site generation as a starting point. And what a change that is from, I don't know, pick your demarcation point in the past. I think that continues. You didn't ask about the, maybe at this layer, but I do see like not consolidation, but more, not just integrated projects and co-development, but just business combinations between those seems kind of inevitable to me. As compute becomes so disproportionately power hungry, even as chips get more efficient and racks get denser and cooling gets better, and all of that stuff kind of points to efficiency improving. I think what does the compute workload look like when anybody can spin up agents running in the background, computing and doing tasks and reasoning all the time in the background? I don't see the demand for compute and the need for power abating in the forecastable future. And who knows, it might be those words and there are other exogenous shocks that can happen. But I just think the ever tighter integration of power and generation and the ancillary functions and equipment coming more under one roof, if for no other reason than procurement, sourcing, and balance sheet efficiency.
See a lot more people getting involved in complex supply chain challenges as well, and those are, to a large degree, the folks that probably be very receptive to this kind of solution. I also think about when we were just talking a few minutes ago about the amount of new people entering this industry that don't have decades of telling you it's the way we've always done it. Well, they didn't, they're not coming in with those habits and those decades of relationships that were built up on the golf course. So perhaps they're a lot more open to being the early adopters on this platform. But it'd be super interesting to check back in another 6, 12, 18 months and see if the use cases that you were planning on ended up being as successful as you thought, and if there were any unexpected surprises in learning the world way.
The thought experiment I keep coming back to is, and I use Microsoft here just because they've been around such a long time, even relative to, compared to a Google or certainly to a Meta, just these gigantic, load centers. And I try to imagine what it would have been like to tell somebody working on OS2 in the 80s or 90s or somebody, just hammering away on operating systems and they might have been thinking of, yeah, well, we might need factories to make, our own boxes at some point, for the computers. And then, just to say, by the way, in 40 or 50 years, you're going to be one of the more active land acquirers in the United States. I think that would have taken some explaining. So I make predictions about the future, even on short cycle, with great humility. But yeah, I mean, there's, some kind of core forces that I think seem to be as dependable as anything else I see when I try to, crystal ball it. And I think the convergence of energy and power on one side and compute on the other seems to be a pretty durable one.
This has been really fascinating, really insightful to see what's going on behind the scenes to build out a company like DMARK. If people that are watching want to learn more about what you're working on or follow you, is LinkedIn, as the website, are those good places to send people?
Yep, both of those. DMARK.energy. You can find us, and there's a contact form there, but also Sean and I are active on LinkedIn, and I'd love to, hear if we can help solve problems, or, just folks wanting to learn more and see if there's a way that, they're thinking about trying to fit into this ecosystem. And thank you so much for having us, Joshua. This has been it's been really enjoyable and a lot of fun to talk.
You're very welcome. And we'll make sure to include links to your individual LinkedIn profiles and the company website as well, to make it super easy for people that are watching the blog, that are looking at the blog post, watching the episode, to learn more. But yeah, I really appreciate it. It's been speaking with Sean McKay and Christian Bonilla, co-CEOs of DMARK Energy Solutions, based out of Iowa and Colorado. Thanks so much for joining me, gentlemen.
Yeah, thank you.
Again.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.